All righty then. Thank you indeed. Did I have my laser back last time? I feel so more confident that I can point. Even if I'm right here, I would still. So, Yancy, George Yancy. Those in the intro class last semester, I think I talked about Yancy in intro, so you may remember George Yancy from a different reading. And you'll recognize his writing style. If you're to be negative about it, it's a bit verbose, perhaps. I don't know that it's repetitive. I think he comes at similar elements in multiple ways to get to the point in a way that you find that similar with Sartre and de Beauvoir as well. But before we jump to Yancy's article, let me wrap up our discussion from we won't be really wrapping it up. We'll be intermingling de Beauvoir's philosophy with that of Yancy's, who, I should tell you, George Yancy is very much influenced by the existentialist tradition, the continental philosophy. He was trained by continental philosophers and analytic philosophers. Yancy is an interesting figure in that respect. He, I think, straddles the divide such that it is, and I think depending on where you are, as we remember from the very beginning of the semester, it's quite a big and in some cases disastrous divide between analytic philosophers, Bertrand Russell, Frege, Wittgenstein, and continental philosophers, Jean-Paul Sartre, de Beauvoir, Wittgenstein, to some extent. He also straddles. And so you'll find both analytic reasoning with Yancy's writing, but also, I think, clear homage or references to the first-person narrative approach that he borrows from de Beauvoir. And he sees that's in part going to be the background of his Beauvoirian, that's how you say that, I think, the Beauvoirian interpretation of Frederick Douglass. This first-person lived experience in situations in which straightforward argumentation in the analytic sense may simply be insufficient. But before I get to that, let's say a little bit more. We left off, I think, did I leave you with this question? Whether or not you agree with her with respect to technology as a drive toward having a certain kind of absolute goals, right? What is it? Sets up absolute goals of saving time and work, enables us to realize comfort and luxury. I think maybe she goes too far with this. Maybe it's right for us to use technology in this way. It's right for us to utilize technology that enables us to have more free time. Let's automate all the crappy jobs so that they don't have to be done. And if you automate enough of them using technology, well, maybe we don't need to work 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, or what ultimately happens, 60 hours a week. People do that. They get into a job that they love. What do they say? If you love what you're doing, you don't have to work a day in your life. What bullshit. You're still working. You just love it. I guess. I don't know. But what do you think of this notion of technology? Yeah, go ahead.
I think there's two sides to it. It's agreeable and disagreeable. Agreeable, depending on your perspective of free time and what you do with it. If your free time is just spent being lazy and not doing anything productive with your life, then yeah.
If I may, productive. That's the operative word there. Productive.
What about it?
Yeah.
What about...
What do you mean? What counts as productive?
That can mean a lot of things. People in their free time, they can be physically productive, meaning they physically exert themselves, they try to, I don't know the opposite of that, like nap or just relax, or you can mentally progress yourself, like trying to mentally fixate on concepts you've been mentally troubling with. Maybe that's just me. Or you could emotionally progress yourself, because especially in this day and age, we are emotionally creatures, and it's hard to control emotions.
So to jump to de Beauvoir and my earlier joke about class struggles and the bourgeoisie, the capitalist viewpoint of productivity, of course, doesn't include, I don't know that it would include any of the things that you mentioned. And so that's interesting. There's all sorts of ways of being productive. Yeah. I could accumulate wealth, and that's productive. Then what do you do with that wealth? I can use it to buy another Porsche, but I don't need another Porsche.
That's why it was going on. Like, it matters, like a matter of perspective. Some people, when they're in their free time, they create mental ideas that can make them miserable and it just degrades their life quality. And some people prosper with a lot of free time and just emotionally progress, mentally regress,
Right.
financially progress. Just depends on who you are as a person and your perspective.
And I think she might accept this. It wastes precious time. I think, she might look at technology of today and see this as problematic. And there may be benefits too. It depends on what we qualify as our values and how we value them. There's a worry of having no values whatsoever and being that kind of ironic cynic who says, it's all just BS, I don't care about anything. That's a problem. Then there's the other problem, the serious man, who says, and it's usually a man for her, and we'll see why that is, but not necessarily, who holds their values as absolute. And we'll see that it's not just a matter of dogmatism, this absolute, but that's going to be a part of it. But sees it as, in Sartrean language, removal of our freedom, our recognition that we have to continue re-upping that value. It's not a matter of that, there's the value I'm living by, it's external to me, it's set in stone, I don't have to worry about it anymore. No. You're engaged in bad faith if you see it that way, if it's external to you. That's going to be the theme throughout most of today. Yes?
I was wondering, is one of her main points that we wouldn't value our life as much if it didn't have an end? So she's saying since we have such limited time, it doesn't make sense to keep accumulating more time or to save up time because she says our existence, we only exist by our time being spent.
Yeah, she doesn't really tell us how we should spend it, although she does elsewhere. How should we spend our time? What is the ultimate value for de Beauvoir? Yeah?
So, did de Beauvoir...
do you have an answer to that?
Question.
But not an answer to that question?
No.
You're answering my question with another question? Where do you get off? What is this, a philosophy class? Go on, and then we'll see if we can.
Did de Beauvoir connect the idea of the serious man to morality? Because in my mind, right, if you have a moral structure, you're projecting yourself into absolutes. So, like, let's say, for example, right, a hypothetical person says, cheating on my spouse is wrong, right, adultery. Stealing is wrong. These are outside moral values that I'm holding as absolutes and that I'm relating to. Is he being a serious man by having those values?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
But wait, it seems like the alternative to that...
Potentially. It depends on how... Yes, because those values are external to you, but you are still adopting them. You are still choosing them. If you say, those are the rules, you've got to follow the rules, where do the rules come from? How do you interpret those rules? In Sartrean language, which she would borrow here, I'm still applying my consciousness, and the meaning of those rules is up to me. It's not, those are the rules, I have to follow them. It's, here are some rules I choose to follow. Here are the reasons why. It's always on me. Rather than to say, I just have to follow those absolutes that are external to me, that were there before me, that I had nothing to do with making. It's the serious man who denies that freedom in constantly, I used the phrase re-upping. That's not the right word.
Like hobo.
What is it?
Like hobo.
Continuing to apply it, continuing to... The example I gave last time about the gambler that Sartre uses. I make a promise to myself never to gamble anymore. That's not something you can do once. You have to continually struggle with it. You have to continually not be drinking. You have to continually not be doing heroin or whatever, is these examples of addictive stuff that I'm constantly responding to. I have to continue being a virtuous person. I'm not virtuous because I gave to a poor guy once. No, you have to continue acting on that. And if it's commands that you're following, even if there is a God that you believe in, you are engaged in bad faith if you don't realize your responsibility in constantly... Why the word is escaping me.
Perpetrating?
What is it?
Perpetrating?
Not perpetrating, that has a negative connotation. Perpetuating is a better one maybe. But the role that you are playing in choosing the meaning of those commands. Because the commands by themselves don't do anything until a human consciousness has confronted it.
So does that mean that like a moral absolute is if I'm with a partner, it's wrong to cheat on her, that in of itself has no intrinsic meaning. What would they?
Not outside of you and the partner, correct. There is no meaning of don't cheat on my spouse without there being individual spouses.
Okay.
Correct, that's correct.
Okay.
For existentialist. I'm sorry, did you have? No? Where was it? Yeah.
So what would you say about precepts? So not exactly like a rule, but...
What would he or she? Who are we talking about?
Sorry, Beauvoir.
Beauvoir, yeah.
Is it serious, like if you have guidelines, but a rule can be broken in certain circumstances? Like how does she interpret that?
She's not a big fan of rules to begin with. Because, again, the rules... If the rule is being followed in a way that denies one's freedom in any way, there is going to be a problem with that. Rules, she would borrow from Aristotle, the rules run out. You can only have so many rules to follow that you abstractly use when you get into various situations. Things change. Let me see if that transitions us into the spirit of seriousness related to this question. What does she mean by the spirit of seriousness? It's the failure to recognize that morality is something that people develop through living, not something embedded in a non-historical or outside of time stuff of nature. Rules don't come to us in any meaningful sense for the existentialist from God, from nature, from culture, that must be followed in some abstract universal sense that denies the lived experiences of individuals. So I think she'd have trouble with the premise that there are these basic rules that are universally applicable. Right. And so there will definitely be exceptions to that.
That's what I'm saying, like with the concept of a precept, is that it's not a rule, it's something that can be broken under certain circumstances. So,
sure.
If it impinges upon your freedom or something like that, then you could break
yes.
that rule.
Yeah, that's a tough one. She says this about oppression. What do you do? And she even says it about oppression perpetrated by those, they're perpetrated, I think, who are doing it somewhat unwillingly. She even mentions the possibility of using force or even violence. Does anyone remember where that is? Did that catch anyone's eye, where she seems to imply responding to oppression with what sounded like another form of oppression? Why am I not able to find that? Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Damn it. Oh. Sorry. I thought I had a note somewhere that was describing that. She certainly is accepting of the use of force. Even there's an interview of her. I have a link to it. She even mentions at one point the use of propaganda. So what do you mean by propaganda? If it's propaganda in the service of a good value, she's actually for it. And she says that explicitly. That's 1959, after she had written The Second Sex and the Ethics of Ambiguity. So if there's a typical precept, think about what she lived through. World War I, World War II, and the propaganda machine of the Nazi Joseph Goebbels. She lived through all that. And yet she seems to not be open to there being an absolute rule against certain things, strategies, tactics like the use of propaganda, which has a wholly negative sense to us. But why? If we can't get to people through logic and reason, maybe other methods are acceptable. And that gets into some interesting debates, which I don't know if we want to do that now. Do you have a question?
Richard Dawkins actually, kind of. Richard Dawkins actually goes into that in the very first part of one of his books, where he says, don't try to appeal to people on a lower sense, because in essence you're putting yourself on a high horse because you're trying to dumb it down for them, when in reality that's just condescension.
Oh, yes, right.
Response
But
to that.
okay.
What if that's the only way they can understand? I'll give personal and other told experiences. Some people, just some people, not people in general, can't mentally conceive. Let's say you're arguing with someone, and they can't mentally conceive what you're talking about, and they're just using aggression to oppress you. Some people will not understand through words or logic because they're so filled with aggression and irritation. What is going on?
You may have to
there's
walk away from that person.
That,
Yeah,
that's
in
the
that
opposite.
case.
That, sometimes you have to just walk away, and then there's also other scenarios where you need to give people a taste of their own medicine. Kind of like maybe the ridiculous of the Nazi ideas, how they had propaganda of photos showing how big the Jews' nose were. They could have done anti-propaganda saying, why is your hair so blonde? Why blonde? Who told you that blonde was the ultimate color? Why blue eyes? Why are the blue eyes so... And you can make fun of, like, a bunch of traits that the Germans had, like supposedly their barrel chest, that's a very typical German trait, and you can make very fat German people because they love their barrel of beer. You can do so many anti-propaganda that's
that's interesting.
Stooping to their level. Worked. Started a fire, that's for sure.
Maybe. That's interesting.
Although they probably would just shot you if they.
Well, that's one of the responses. But there is something there to be said about what sounds like, is it propaganda or is it a kind of subversion? And that will take us to Frederick Douglass, because what did he deal with? He dealt with stereotypes that constructed him as a thing, as Yancy puts it. How do you respond to that when it's so obvious to the oppressor, and they know it, the oppressor knows it, that you are a human being? How do you respond to that? Arguments seem odd, right? Here's a premise. Here's another premise. I conclude I'm a human being. It's a weird thing to have to do. And Douglass doesn't do that. And he's explicit. He could do it, right? He could very easily do it, which actually, well, I'll get to that. I'm jumping a little bit ahead. But the spirit of seriousness plays a role. In fact, this ties into, there's Richard Wright, very much influence, a very big influence on Simone de Beauvoir when she traveled to the United States. Richard Wright, a very famous writer in his own right. Existentialist, influenced by W.E.B. Du Bois. We'll talk about him a little bit. And influenced by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Richard Wright, who is addressing issues of racism in the United States during Jim Crow era predominantly. He has a relatively short story called The Man Who Lived Underground. You see the connection clearly. And The Man Who Lives Underground is a Dostoevsky type figure, but not as spiteful about himself as an individual. The same issues of freedom come up, the same issues of responsibility, lucidity of consciousness that we find in Dostoevsky, but it's appealed to or it's applied to issues of race in America in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. It's extremely well written. It's very difficult, but you find yourself just reading through it in one setting. It's stream of consciousness, phenomenological, ethical, and existential, all of these in one. Yes?
Is the ethics of ambiguity intended to oppose the Platonic worldview and the world of ideal forms?
Yes, one of them. Not necessarily that, or not just that, but yes. She's not a big fan of Plato's idealized absolutes that are supposedly the cause and the ideal for this life of individuality. The individual is seen as merely a copy, as seen as a shadow, ultimately, and it limits the individual in the Platonic sense.
So
She does not care for this.
the first time that the intellectuals of a society started to revolt against Plato? Because I thought that the Platonic worldview was pretty dominant.
It was right after Plato, his student Aristotle.
Oh, okay.
So immediately, what are forms, Plato? How do they have causal power? Plato's conception of forms and the problems that arise from it, Aristotle raised immediately, saying your conception of forms as this transcendent, otherworldly, which gets next here, otherworldly realm is as difficult to explain how a mind that is not physical can cause things to happen in the physical world, just to use our example from the philosophy of mind section. So Aristotle raised considerable questions about it right away. And so you find divisions among Aristotelians and Platonists. So where does she get from Richard Wright, and how does this connect to, and we'll see with Yancy and questions regarding the second sex as well, the readings will intertwine here. What does she take this concept of oppression to be, and how it is operative? She traveled to the United States and was absolutely stunned. She put it very interestingly. She felt the weight of her whiteness, I think is how she put it, when she went to, I think she went to Mississippi. That's in the 1950s, I think it was. And she experienced the difference in how people with darker skin lived versus in the United States. And she learns a lot. She gets a lot from Richard Wright. Yancy, I think, makes that connection too. And I think she's influenced by him, Richard Wright, and others from the African American experience, from the black experience, and she applies that to the experience of the feminine, of the woman, of women. And there's some translation problems from the translation I gave you, because there's not a good translation of the second sex yet. There should be, but there isn't one apparently. There's some serious problems. I'll talk about that in a moment. In any case, how does she conceive oppression? She says, in order to prevent a revolt, she's talking about, I meant to reference this, open this up a little bit before. So the oppressed, this is page 5 of the reading you had from Ethics of Ambiguity, the oppressed has only one solution: to deny the harmony of mankind from which an attempt is made to exclude him, the oppressed. To prove that he is a man and that he is free by revolting against the tyrants. In order to prevent this revolt, one of the ruses of oppression is to camouflage itself behind a natural situation, since after all, one cannot revolt against nature. She goes on, when a conservative wishes to show that the proletariat is not oppressed, actually, is this the next quote? Yeah. No, I guess that's not the next thing. When a conservative wishes to show that the proletariat is not oppressed, he declares that the present distribution of wealth is a natural fact and that there is thus no means of rejecting it, and doubtless he has a good cause for providing that. Strictly speaking, he is not stealing from the worker the product of his labor, since the word theft supposes social conventions, which in other respects authorizes this type of exploitation. If it's a natural phenomenon, if you were born that way, the spirit of seriousness, the serious man who appeals to absolutes, ignoring their free choices involved in perpetuating the system, the systemic and systematic oppression. If you make those who are oppressed feel as if, it's the weather, it's the heat, it's the earthquake that struck. Who fights against earthquakes? It's sad, it's unfortunate. People say things like, it is what it is after the earthquake. What are you going to do? It is what it is. Imagine that after slavery. Why am I being separated from my wife? Why am I being separated from my children? Why am I continually being whipped for trying to learn how to read? Well, you're a slave. It sucks. It is what it is. What are you going to do? Why is it that you are not allowed to work? Why is it that you are not allowed a formal education? Why is it that you, when you are allowed to work, don't get paid nearly as much as men? Why is it that as a woman you don't get to make choices in your familial relations? Why do you not have the freedom that so many others do, that the other half of the population does? Well, that's the nature of the sexes. And if you make it natural, it's hard to refute it. As she puts it, you can't, such a situation is never natural. Man is never oppressed by things. To say that the weather is oppressive is a confusion of that term. Weather doesn't oppress. Don't say that. Right? Each question?
Oh, well, is this where, the argument against essence preceding existence comes in? Yeah? Is that what you're talking about right now?
And Yancy will pick up on that theme as well. That's right. That's exactly right. Because what is the existentialist motto? Going back to Jean-Paul Sartre. That's how you say it if you want to be arrogant. Sartre.
Existence precedes essence.
Existence precedes essence. That's not the case for Yancy, as he mentions, when Yancy discusses the white's perspective of blacks. From Yancy's perspective, going back to Douglas, but he would argue that's still the case today, with varying differences, of course. I'll get to that. But the motto is reversed, and it's seen for women, it's seen for blacks in particular, that their essence precedes their existence. They are already predefined, and they're defined from the outside. And they're defined by the white, they're defined by whites as other. And this term other, alterity, comes from de Beauvoir, who gets it largely from Althusser and well, not Althusser. The name just flew out the window. I don't know. It'll come back to me. What is it? Oh, that was a cough. Never mind. I thought somebody had the answer. I thought somebody was hiding the answer in a cough. No? So in any case, such a situation is never natural. Man is never oppressed by things unless he is a naive child who hits stones, or a mad prince who orders the sea to be thrashed. I believe there was a Roman general who did that once. He was angry that the weather affected his ability to win a battle, and he went out and attacked the sea, charged the sea with some crime. That seems a bit crazy, does it not? And yet, what is de Beauvoir's point? If you can make your situation appear inevitable, like Sisyphus, death is inevitable, and so the mode of revolt, the mode of response to it, we talked about this with Camus, is going to be very different. Why would I respond to the inevitability and oppressive, I put that in quotes, oppressive nature of my finitude? De Beauvoir is aware of this. You don't respond to the inevitability of death with revolt, with rebellion. That's absurd. Rebellion, revolt is not something that is even possible, right? That leads to all sorts of ridiculous consequences. But if I can make my systematic mistreatment of a different group of people seem objectively natural, decreed by God, decreed by nature, decreed by science, decreed by something other than individual contingent choices, that is to say, not necessary, but contingent, dependent upon what people do and continue to do over time. Not just done once, but continue. You continue to choose to see women as inferior. It's not just a one-off thing. You continue to choose to see different races as inferior. It can't be just a one-off thing. In fact, as de Beauvoir is going to put it, it is androcentricity. Androcentricity? God, that's a weird word. Is a kind of choice. As Yancy is going to say, whiteness is a choice, which may have been the weirdest thing you read. How is that a choice? What does he mean by that? And he borrows a lot from de Beauvoir. The Second Sex, this is the more recent cover of the translation. And it's complete unabridged for the first time. Where's the date? 2010, I think it is. New translation, because the previous translation from 1953 was by a zoologist. Seriously, why a zoologist? I've forgotten. I think because he spoke French, I guess. And he wrote it, and it was clearly, apparently, quite clear. His translation was filled with the misogyny of the 1940s. And I don't know how she must have been quite upset about this. She could read English. I don't know that she spoke it very well, but she could definitely read English, so she wasn't terribly pleased about it. And yet there hasn't been one until 2010. I'm told that this one's not very good either. So there's some problems with that, because the translators, it's not translation, it's an interesting philosophical theme itself. Translation is not just, here's French, and I'll just put the English version. You have to know the concepts, you have to know the history, you have to know her interpretation of these concepts and what her philosophical view is. Being a zoologist is that's the wrong background. You are not an expert in that field. You can't just be somebody who knows French. You have to know the existentialist philosophy of this particular person. And the translator, whose name escapes me, it's in too many damn papers. Oh, did I not bring it? Oh, there it is. H.M. Parsley. H.M. Parsley. Anyway, that was somewhat problematic. But notice the reading, the concepts that she uses, you're going to see in Yancy as well. So you're not born what you become, right? That has something to do with choices. It implies even this notion of sexes as well. And I think you get a sense of what the second sex is, this early feminist interpretation. It's pretty clear where she's coming from with respect to this. And in the 1940s, we might say, well, yeah, I guess that was obvious back then. Do you think it was? Do you think the things that she was saying back then were obvious to everyone? And do you think people read this in 1949 and said, yeah, of course it's right? Or what do you think they said?
Not that.
Not that.
Was it even read very widely when it was first published in America?
I think so. By then, she was well known. This was in 1953 that partially translates it. So yes, and existentialism started to spread considerably because of Sartre, Camus, and all the young jazz singers. And there's a movement of all people wearing black leather. And she was asked this at one point. What do you think about all these young kids listening to jazz? This jazz was like seen as revolutionary at that time. Of course, borrowed, if I may, from, of course, black musicians, but they did not get the credit at the time. And she was aware of that point. And she thought, well, I don't care about that as long as they get the central tenet related to freedom. So, in any case, it was widely read. Yes.
At the time, in 1949, in science, a lot of scientists, majority male, were trying to prove that the male brain was indeed a male superior brain than that of a female brain, and this applies and actually is being studied way more significantly. The brain is more like a gender mosaic rather than two sexes, and that's exactly what that says. Nurture rather than nurture.
This one says. Mm-hmm. And so you're saying that de Beauvoir was correct when she says, page 14, the fact is that every concrete human being is always a singular, separate individual. To decline to accept such notions as the eternal feminine, the black soul, the Jewish character, is not to deny that Jews, Negroes, women exist today. This denial does not represent a liberation for those concerned, but rather a flight from reality. So she admits that there are, of course, differences between males and females. But the idea that there is an eternal feminine, that there is a black soul, that there are, in other words, an essence to people in this way, that seems to be quite problematic. It's true to say that we have social constructions of race and gender. She doesn't use the term social construction, I don't think, but the language is similar enough that I wrote a note somewhere saying, hey, social construction. I can't find that now. But to say that something is socially constructed, as opposed to biologically, essentially, naturally occurring, doesn't mean it's not real. Doesn't mean there aren't real effects. And I'm going to come back to that with Yancy in a moment.
Well, yeah, kind of just extending off of what she said, it kind of was just culture and what they knew at quote, quote, what they knew at the time was right, because 200 years ago we thought that blacks were physically, most blacks were physically inferior to white people for many reasons, because of something as dumb as the thickness of their skull or something about the size of their feet. There's really many reasons at all. And same thing with women, it's just culture with a majority of people, and even women, some women, not all women, accepted the fact, I'm supposed to stay at home, I'm supposed to not really go out and work, that's the man's job. Some of them accepted the gender roles, but...
Yeah, and you see that as a response. Phyllis Schlafly, for example, was a very famous woman who reacted to I guess in this case, the second wave of the feminist movement, arguing against this kind of liberation movement, arguing that there is a benefit to the conservative roles that have been historically, and indeed there are arguments to that effect. They're not arguments that de Beauvoir would advocate for, because they are inherently removing the liberty of half of the population. And you're right to point out the historical element of this. This is why I think in science classes, the fact that they don't teach history much in science, I think is a problem. Because there is a lot to be said for historical analysis of scientific ideas, of where did the scientific ideas come from? Well, for the vast majority of our history, they've come from men. And we think, well, so science is objective. Is it? I mean, has it ever been? If you look back, you can see how lacking in objectivity many of the studies that come out, in particular about race and in particular about gender, it's laughable to say that those are objective. Maybe today things are more objective. But then you look at studies from psychology, I don't remember how to spell weird, Is it I?
That's right, that's right.
Okay. Did I show you this?
Except after C.
And in the word weird. Western educated industrial rich democracies. This is the name of a paper that it was a meta-analysis of psychological studies about human nature. Where do most psychology professors, studies, scientists, where do they get most of their data about humans? In the
Their foundation,
what?
where they are from.
Where do the psychologists get the information, the data about human nature? What do they do? What kind of? They do studies, right? And who are the subjects of their studies? What is it? Usually they were men. That's changed within the last 40 years. But that's significant. That's significant. They were mostly men, and so now we know something about human nature. You would study elements about humans, about women, in fact, and you would use men as the studies, assuming that women were just inferior men. That's ultimately one way of looking, and going all the way back to Aristotle. Talk about objectivity there. That's interesting. Most studies, up until, and I think this may still be the case in many cases, the problem of replicability, reproducibility in scientific studies about psychology, they come from students at universities in the United States, because that's cheap. It's easy to get a lot of students and use them as your sample. And so what the psychologists have been doing to study human nature, I keep doing this because, of course, Beauvoir doesn't like the idea of there being a human nature, is that we go from Western, educated, industrial-rich democracies and know about our sample that we know about are all people like that, and then we generalize across the human population. What do Americans make up? 5% of the world population? What do American university students make up of the world population? And yet we take that as the marker of humanity. And that's not 1950. That's not 1850. That's 2010. And to see the importance of de Beauvoir's writing still today, I think, connects with us. And here, this is the transition into the next reading. She says, in particular, into Yancy, those who are condemned to stagnation, this is a long quote, are often pronounced happy on the pretext that happiness consists in being at rest. This gets at her general existentialist themes here. This notion we reject, for our perspective is that of existentialist ethics. Every subject plays its part, as such, specifically through exploits or projects that serve as a mode of transcendence. There's the language we saw with Sartre. It achieves liberty only through a continual reaching out towards other liberties. There is no justification for present existence other than its expansion into an indefinitely open future. Every time transcendence falls back into immanence, stagnation, or facticity, terms will come back again with Yancy, there is a degradation of existence into the ensoi, or the in itself, the unconscious object, the thing. And that's what Yancy's going to be focusing on too. The brutish life of subjection to given conditions and of liberty into constraint and contingence. This downfall represents a moral fault if the subject consents to it. She talks a lot about consent there. And oppression. And oftentimes seems to imply complicity of the individual with respect to their oppression. And there we might find the Sartrean influence being a little too strong. Why am I complicit in my oppression? Simply because I'm not constantly fighting against it. Go back to our discussion of Jean Harvey. What's the role of the oppressed with respect to resistance? Am I morally obligated to resist? And how so can I resist when I, as a woman, find it so difficult to find means of engaged in groups? The women's liberation movement was an attempt at taking women out. And this is one of the central differences between the black experience and a woman's experience, is that women are intimately intertwined with men in a way that blacks might not be intimately intertwined with whites. Do you see what I mean? She touches on this. Women are wives. Women are mothers. And yet, it may be that they're in a familiar relationship because of the system that we're in, who are oppressed. Do you see what I mean? The difficulty of separating that. There's parallels with respect to issues of race, but I think she's pointing out a significant difference there. In any case, she says this downfall, this moral fault, if the subject consents to it, if it is inflicted upon him, it spells frustration and oppression. In both cases, and I was fascinated that she used that language, it is an absolute evil. I think the only time that you would use this term is with respect to the removal of freedom or the limitation of human freedom. Every individual concerned to justify his existence feels that his existence involves an undefined need to transcend himself to engage in freely chosen projects. She expands on this in this interview from 1959. So it's about 40 minutes, and it covers everything, I think, too quickly. The interviewer, this is in Canada, it's in French, but there's subtitles. He goes too quickly through all the questions. He goes from questions of human nature to God, to oppression, and there's a couple of key points you might want to focus on when you get a chance to watch it. But it's interesting to be able to see the philosophers talk and respond to questions. All right, so let me transition. I was going to cover Simone de Beauvoir's A Very Easy Death, which was a memoir about the death of her mother. I encourage you to read that if you have the time at some point. You can find it online. Let me jump to Yancy now to catch up. And then we'll get through. I'll mention a few things about Lewis Gordon at the end and his conception of bad faith, borrowing from Sartre and de Beauvoir, as it transitions into the philosophy of religion. So that's what we'll try to end with, a transition. Since we're making a transition here, anyone have any transitional jokes? Or just a joke? No? You don't have to have one. It's a good time for it. Nobody does. Yeah?
What do you call a flirty philosopher?
What do you call a what?
A flirty philosopher.
Flirty philosopher? I don't know.
Socrates.
Ah! Socrates! Yes. He was a tease. Just ask Alcibiades, am I right? Ancient humor. All right. George Yancy. He's now at Emory. The reading you had when he was at Duquesne. There's a link to his. He writes for The Stone, which is a blog on the New York Times. He's written a lot of things there. The last one he wrote. Well, that's not the last one. He's written more recently on issues of blackface. Actually, that was a couple. It was this year at least. 2015, he wrote an open letter to white America about issues of race, the sort of things that he talks about in the reading. It was writing that was a lot more accessible, much less existentialist vocabulary. However, you got all the vocabulary, right? Okay. What was the response? Well, an inordinate amount of death threats. And the N-word was used considerably in all of the comments. It's amazing. You get a real sense of humanity when you look at the comments section. And the things that he was saying were the things that he wrote about in the reading you had for today. This is 2015. This is not 1815. And the death threats were the hatred was more dominant than was the positive in his open letter to white America. And in it he talks about, you might, if you took intro with me, I think it was last semester, we talked about Yancy and his article, Elevator Social Spaces and Racism. And you'll see he discusses this too in the reading you had for today on page 299. He says, well dressed, I enter an elevator. So here he's talking about the experience he has in what he'll call the spaces of the quotidian. And by quotidian, he just means the everyday. I enter an elevator where a white woman waits to reach her floor. She sees my black body, though not in the same one I've seen reflected back to me in the mirror on any number of occasions. Despite what I think about myself, how I am for myself, there's the Sartrean language, the pour soi. Her perspective, her third-person account seeps into my consciousness. I catch a glimpse of myself through her eyes, and just for that moment I experience some form of double consciousness. this concept of double consciousness also comes up in the reading for today. What is double consciousness? For those who may remember.
Putting yourself
It
in someone else's perspective.
could be, not always. That's a positive. I think you're right to see that there is a positive of double consciousness. And he's open to that possibility, but he focuses on, it's a term that goes back to W.B. Du Bois, who I'll show in a moment. Does anyone remember what double consciousness is? Yeah?
In the elevator, he was conscious of his presence and how the white woman next to him perceived him, and for a moment he was confused because it didn't reflect, and she was worried about him being there, but that didn't reflect his intentions, so for a moment he was being himself and understood what she perceived him as. So he saw these two different consciousnesses, essentially.
With himself as an object. It's the Sartrean look as well, where I see myself as an object, which we all go through this, but the worry is that we see oneself only as an object from the other perspective. Madeline, did you want to? Yep. Go ahead. Yeah? It'll come back to you?
Yeah.
What if I shone the laser in your face? Would that help? I want to be able to use it in some way. Close your eyes. Aren't there treatments for lasers? Isn't there laser treatments for? It's probably not good for you. I'm not that kind of doctor, so I'm gonna. So here's W.B. Du Bois. What he means by it, and he had two senses of it, but he focused predominantly on the negative sense. It's a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. And he's writing at the time, this is in, 1902, I think. The Souls of Black Folk is the name of the book. Extraordinarily, greatly influenced by the writings of Frederick Douglass. It is a kind of multiple seeing of oneself that's forced upon you. Those on the margins of society are oftentimes forced to see this way, to take on different perspectives. Because if they don't, right, it's a matter of survival to be able to do this, a kind of epistemic advantage. Epistemic having to do with knowledge, in this case, an advantage with respect to perspectives that others have of you. It's not that they are good at it naturally, it's because of the contingent histories such that the marginalized folks have to be aware of how they're being perceived, especially black males, let's say in the Deep South. If you make eye contact with white women, they call that reckless eyeballing, and you could be lynched. And this is the kind of thing that Simone de Beauvoir talks about and is greatly aware of when she traveled there. Yeah.
Does the opposite side also experience double consciousness, like do privileged people?
Good. Yancy wants to say that they can, and there's a potential benefit to be able to expand to break one's presumption of what Sartre will call solipsism, the assumption that there's only my perspective. From the privileged perspective, I don't have to worry about other perspectives. Unless I want to, but that's hard. That takes effort, and I have to continually practice at it. And I don't want to get too much into the question of privilege. Peggy McIntosh, is it McIntosh? Yeah, the knapsack, the invisible knapsack of white privilege. It's hard to keep track of that. It's oftentimes you get reminded of it. But one of the things about privilege is that you don't have to think about those privileges. But if you're on the other end, you really need to be concerned about it all the time. And it's not because you want to, it's that you don't have any other options. And you see this with Chris Rock talking to his children. He has to tell his 6-year-old, and my son is 8, and I can't imagine having to have this conversation, but he has to sit his son down and say, look, you need to be really cautious about how you react and act around, for instance, police officers. You need to be aware of their perspective of you. And that's a conversation that black parents have with their black children at a very young age. White parents, I do have that conversation, but only because I constantly read this. And I don't have to otherwise. And I could go my life without having to consider anyone else's perspective. It's very easy, in fact, to do that. It requires a kind of jolt. It requires being reminded constantly. And straightforward arguments is not always the best mode of shifting perspective, opening perspective, and so forth. Yeah.
What would you say to someone who claims that privilege does not exist?
Oh, I don't know. What would you say? Well, it depends how they said it. If they just said, hey, check your privilege, then I would say, you have to tell me more. You can't just say, check my privilege. You have to say, what have I done that manifests privilege? Because you halt the conversation just as quickly as I halt it if I were to say, there's no such thing as privilege. I think comedy is actually a pretty good way of going about it. And there's a lot of comedians who address that. And if I had my iPhone with me, if I had an iPhone, I would look up, I'm sorry, Louis C.K. has a really good bit on this. I apologize for mentioning him again. It's a 2.5-minute bit. Amar Rahman has a wonderful bit with respect to reverse racism and has a lot to do with privilege as well. 2.5 minutes. It doesn't take much to show those. And that opens up the possibility of conversation in a way that perhaps just saying, here's the privilege you have, and it's obvious, people don't like to hear that. And I think the concept is too fraught. The concept of privilege is vague. It's also ambiguous. And I think there are too many nuances that McIntosh and other scholars, like Lewis Gordon, who focuses on this, Michael Monahan's another, that once it becomes in the public sphere, it loses its force. And anytime you popularize a concept, nuance dissipates. And then you just get fighting back and forth. So if you have the time, you can talk about it, you can reason out what privilege actually means, and I don't think it's obvious. And I'm not kidding about the comedy. No joke. Okay, go on.
The last thing I wanted to say is that if you have to apologize for bringing up a sexual predator, you should not do it.
That's true, that's a good point. However, we did talk about him before and why I mentioned him. Is he a sexual predator? Probably, in a way, yes. I think that's the right term. And Kant was, and actually this comes up in the reading for today. Doesn't he mention Kant and Hume and Locke and a number of other philosophers in the history of philosophy who were unmistakably racist? Yeah, there's a problem.
That's an excuse at the time.
We could rely on that perhaps, but I'm of the opinion clearly that we can utilize the philosophy of Kant, we can utilize the philosophy of Hume, and we can point out the complexities, the moral complexities. I'm also of the opinion, apparently, because I keep using it, that there's material we can use from Woody Allen, as I do at the end of the semester. There's material that's educational, that is pedagogically useful, that there are other sources too, but in some cases, that's the best encapsulation of the point that I want to make. And I can make that point without saying, it's not a good point because the person making it is not a good person, right? And it's a flawed person, there's no doubt with respect to Louis C.K. But I don't think that means we can never use their material to make a point. We may be getting a little, well, maybe not. I don't want to get too far off because it's a tough discussion. In fact, the reason I used him is to bring this discussion up. Yeah. In the earlier part of the semester. Yeah.
For the other examples, those are all contexts of the time.
Yeah. This was 8 years ago. Yeah.
This.
And
It's 5 sections.
not that long ago. That's true. Yeah. And his bit on white male privilege, believe it or not, was in 2008. And I think the bit, like an argument, can stand on its own. If the conclusion was, and Louis C.K. is not a sexist pig, well, that would be different. But the conclusion of the thought experiments, of the jokes, which are kind of thought experiments, is that white male privilege is a real thing. And this is a demonstration of it. From a white male privileged sex. I don't know what sex, what was the term we used? Offender. Yeah, I guess in a way you can call it that. But yeah, it's complex. And how do we relate this to double consciousness? Well, And that's why I mentioned comedy. Comedy is a way of getting people who may have a position of privilege to see differently, because there's a sense in which straightforward argument is unpleasant. Comedy is indirect. You can still make arguments through comedy. You can still make arguments through story. Let me get back to this, and I don't want to dismiss that conversation, but we did introduce. Maybe it wasn't this class that we talked about that. Was it a different class we talked about Louis C.K.? Because I remember having this conversation before. Okay, yeah, all right. Maybe this should be limited. Well, I'll consider that. So back to Yancy. He says, this is the point you raised earlier about the existentialist credo and how it's reversed for issues of race. From the perspective of whiteness, I am contrary to the existentialist credo, an essence, blackness that precedes my existence. Hence, my emergence upon the historical scene requires that I engage in battle, not only iconographic, semiotic, but existential. Of course, we're interested in the existential. The iconographic has to do with images, symbols, the semiotic, so stereotypical imagery and so forth. Propaganda that was discussed earlier. These are the kinds of things that he's constantly having to battle. But also existential. And this takes us to Frederick Douglass. Why is he seen as an existentialist? The Beauvoirian analysis is showing how similar, and it's interesting how he does this. Her analysis borrows from Richard Wright and other early black philosophers, sociologists, and writers, and we see it sort of going back and forth. Douglass, as you may know, was a slave. Then he was freed. He was an abolitionist. He learned how to read, although that was against the law. That's significant. That's, in fact, one of the most significant things in his autobiographies. And it's significant also, his autobiography, as Yancy points out, is written by himself, making it clear that his perspective is being given. This is why is it redundant to say here's my autobiography written by myself? That's obviously on purpose. It's not. It's a purposeful sort of rhetorical ploy here. He's writing at a time in which his words are more free than he is. His words are able to cross continents, and they did. He actually did travel to Europe at one point and was able to go on a speaking tour and do quite well. But in the United States, he couldn't travel across some state lines due to the Fugitive Slave Law, Fugitive Slave Act, in which he could be forced back into slavery. And he's fully well aware of this, and that comes up in the writing. This concept, this idea of Frederick Douglass as seen through the lenses of existentialism goes back at least to 2000. The year 2000, when Lewis Gordon wrote his book, Existentia Africana, where he spends a whole chapter discussing the connections of existentialist themes from Sartre and de Beauvoir, primarily Sartre in that case, and how Douglass becomes, it's fascinating, the language in Douglass's own autobiography, how he becomes a man. He references this perspective that's seen through the language of what later will become Sartrean existentialism. And he doesn't use the phrase bad faith, that's a term that Sartre employs, but he uses other language that shows the clear deception of the individuals who are oppressing, that it's a constant choice, that it's a constant, again, I don't have a word for it, re-upping. What the hell does re-upping mean? But that's what keeps coming to mind. When you prohibit the slaves to read, what absurdity is going on there? Why is there what Sartre would call bad faith? What is it about a slave owner and a slave owning system that says, no, slaves, it's against the law to teach them to read? Why is that significant? What's that?
It suppresses personal freedoms.
That's for sure. Where's the bad faith, though? Where is the self-deception on the part of the oppressors?
That they think.
Oh, yeah, go
The
ahead.
slave owner's argument is that black people are naturally slaves, but if they were allowed to read, it would inspire the desire for freedom that is consistent with all of humanity.
Well put. That's right. Did you want to add to it?
I was gonna say that, like, they say that black people are slaves because they're too dumb, but then, like,
Yep.
but then by not teaching them,
Yes.
they're keeping them that way.
This is the same argument that Beauvoir mentions, going back to an early feminist named Mary Estelle, who says, damn it. She has a great analogy of the man who thinks he's really impressive with respect to his education is like, in contrast to women's intelligence, is like a man who feels courageous and brave for beating somebody whose hands are bound. She said it much better. I can't. You get the point of the analogy. At once, the system precludes by law women from getting formal education. And then the males make fun of the women for not having a formal education. It's like breaking somebody's legs and then laughing at them for not being able to win a race. Say, well, of course I can't win. You broke my damn legs. Ah, see how inferior you are? You have caused this situation, and you constantly cause this situation. To say blacks should not be, that slaves should not be taught to read, is at once to admit, well, clearly, they're not cattle, they're not chattel, they're not things. You admit that by the very law that, there's no laws against precluding cattle from learning how to read. Douglas makes that joke. Douglas says this. I've been helped to bear this with a sense of humor throughout. And he uses comedy. He uses humor, not frivolous humor. It's a kind of subversion. It has a multitude of approaches and responses to the absurdities of oppression. And with respect to perspective, that's the other thing. He's challenging the racist assumption that black people have no perspective on the world. That's another mode of seriousness, where you deny the subject of the other by seeing them literally as merely an object, by defining them in terms of absolutes that are either determined by the myths. De Beauvoir would call them the myth of the spirit of seriousness that comes from the divine, or that comes from nature, or that comes from whatever culture is, as if it had nothing to do with individual human choices. The term she uses is contingent choices that we continually facilitate. Thus it is that no group, this is a bit of a confusing quote, no group that ever sets itself up as the one without at once setting up the other over against itself. It is not the other who, in defining himself as the other, establishes the one. The other, in this case blackness, is posed as such by the one, in this case whiteness. Yancy is borrowing the language of de Beauvoir here. She would refer to this with respect to male and female, or man and woman, in defining himself as the one. In other words, to put it in language of today, white is the norm, and whiteness is rarely considered. This goes back to the discussion of privilege in a way. I don't have to think about my whiteness when I walk into a room. I don't have to think about my maleness when I walk into a room. I was at a conference last week, and when a black presenter was in, black woman in particular, I did not ask her, but I'm certain, she being one of the very few black philosophers and black female philosophers, was abundantly aware of that fact. That goes with the experience, and that changes the experience. It's a kind of privilege to not have to even think about that. It's not even a consideration for me. I don't have to consider how I dress, although I obviously dress in very expensive ways. But George Yancy has to consider it. George Yancy has to be aware of how he is perceived. You may remember this from the other class. He would walk on his own campus. He's been there for 10 years, professor of philosophy. He continually gets stopped by the campus police. May we help you? That's the question. And if it happened just once, understandable. Oh, you just made a mistake. No, it's okay. I'm a professor of philosophy. I'm wearing a coat and tie. Yeah, I got a hat on, but I'm a professor here. I know my way around campus. But when it happens again and again, when he sees somebody in the elevator reacting as the woman did, just once, not a big deal. But if it happens cumulatively over and over and over again, you walk past cars and the doors are locking. It's not once. It's a multitude of times. that changes one's perspective. And you come to realize, well, wait a minute, maybe there's something about how I'm being defined essentially. And ideally, we want to get to a point, don't we, where color is seen as, that is, skin color or gender, is seen as morally irrelevant with respect to how we perceive others, with respect to how we act with and for others. Why don't we just, as Stephen Colbert, to go back to comedy, as Stephen Colbert put it, I don't see color. I assume you're a white person because you're wearing an Izod shirt or something. I can't remember how he did it. You know what I'm talking about. He doesn't see color. He's joking, of course. I don't care if you're black or white or purple. I treat everyone the same. To which one might respond, here might be a response to that. That's a lie. You would treat a purple person differently. If you saw a purple person, you're not going to deny that the person's purple. First of all, you'd think, oh my God, is that person lacking oxygen? What's happening to that person? You see color. Of course you do. Those are objective facts. What the color means is contingently historically determined. Caused, excuse me, that's the wrong word there, yeah.
It's incredibly important to recognize color not because of some type of oppression, but for reparations based on.
So, wait a minute, aren't we playing identity politics? And that comes up, wait a minute, isn't identity politics have to do with my membership in a group? And don't I dissolve into a group thereby removing my individuality in an existentialist sense? That's extremely complex. And there's not an easy way of answering that in 2 minutes. But that's right. Don't play identity politics. Quit playing that game. Yancy's response to that would be, the history of America is nothing but identity politics. And we talked about this before, I think. You are a citizen with rights and privileges depending upon the identity, the group to which we identify you. Remember the one-drop rule? You got just a little bit of black blood in you, you are black. For the purposes of identification. It has been identity politics for the vast majority of this country's history. And now to say, let's stop playing identity politics, as if everything were just equal, you start to see why this is a problem. And in fact, this goes back to 1962, jumping ahead here. Why don't we just be colorblind? Isn't a colorblind society the ideal? I think James Baldwin puts it very well. And this ties in with what Yancy has been talking about. Bad faith or blind faith. I find that, see, I was trying to be clever there. I think it's not bad. It's a little bit of work needed done. But he says this to his cousin. Is it his cousin? No, his nephew. He says, look, many people, he's giving advice, like I was talking about with Chris Rock, we're almost done, to his young nephew about the changing world in which they were living. This is 1962. He says, many of white people indeed know better, but as you will discover, people find it difficult to act on what they know. To act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. This is very de Beauvoirian. In this case, the danger in the minds and hearts of most white Americans is the loss of their identity. Try to imagine how you would feel if you woke up one morning to find the sun shivering and all the stars aflame. You would be frightened because it is out of the order of nature. Any upheaval in the universe is terrifying because it is so profoundly attacks one's sense of one's own reality. Well, the black man has functioned in the white man's world as a fixed star, as an immovable pillar, and as he moves out of this place, this is where the civil rights movement is starting to change things. Heaven and earth are shaken to their foundations. In other words, it's going to affect the identity of whiteness, which has otherwise not been thought of. That's actually a pretty nice quote to end with. There's more to say about this, but not much. So for next time, you do have a quiz. Please get that done online. You have until Wednesday to get that in before class. And next time you got Dostoevsky. Back to Dostoevsky, Grand Inquisitor, into the philosophy of religion. I'll transition into that with a little bit of discussion on Yancy and Lewis Gordon for next time. See you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Do you know?
That was okay.
Do you know exactly what Woody Allen or Louis C.K. did?
I know what Louis C.K. did. Well, yeah, I do. Yes.
Louis C.K. masturbated in front of someone.
Well,
He also unlocked parking
Five something.
survivors.
after, when did he do that? Recently, didn't he?
Mhm.
Yeah. So he tried to come back to his comedy tour, and I don't
Woody
know.
Allen sexually assaulted his 7-year-old adopted daughter.
Yeah.
You can explain things without those books.
Yes. So, I think you can.
Well, you're a good
Or
teacher.
just acknowledge the things.
Oh, and I do. Yeah, absolutely.
Such like you would with Kant, as in Kant is a racist.
He is, yes.
You wouldn't say Kant is a racist. You'd
I
say he's
wouldn't
a
say that.
racist.
I'd-
But you said, we might say he's a sex offender, but I don't know about that word.
He is a sex offender.
He masturbated in front of
Yeah.
5 unconsensual women.
Right.
If that's not a sex offender.
Yeah, I don't know enough about all the details of it, that's why I didn't assert that.
Understanding
But
it's not from malice.
Yeah, I also would clarify, my concern is that he gets equated with a Jeffrey Epstein or Weinstein?
Yeah.
I think, morally speaking, there has to be a difference in degree. And I think that's my reticence, my hesitance there.
You said,
But
you're a professor of philosophy, right? Like qualifying literally everything you say is like kind of part of the game. So when you're like hesitant to make accusations like that, I don't think it's malicious. It's
Oh, no, I don't think that, I didn't take that as
like a
the
placement.
concern. No, I think it's a fair point.
I know it's coming from a teaching standpoint.
Yeah, no, and the reason I use him is to address some of the times the analysis is right on, and other times it's unnecessary to use him as an example. That's a fair point. But also it does allow for that very teaching moment, and it gets into the moral dilemma of what do we do with information that comes from horribly flawed people. Do we get rid of it altogether?
Well, I mean,
Which we
I'm
can-
not
we-
going to
we
throw
mi-
out Kant's categorical imperative
Right.
because he's vehemently sexist.
Right.
But I'm going to note that he's vehemently
Yeah.
sexist when I'm
Yeah,
reading these things. And
yes.
I didn't actually even know Hume or Kant were had extremely anti-black racist sentiments until this year, and
Yeah.
I've been studying for 2 now. So
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't either.
cognitive
I didn't
dissonances are
learn
very
about
often skipped over.
the issues of, and again, there's the concern about it, the issue of it being a long time in the past. My response to that is these are philosophers who are being inconsistent in their own philosophy.
Absolutely.
So that's where their critique can hold. And same thing with Louis C.K. His material can be feminist, as a colleague of mine has written about. And she argues that the material is feminist, but him as a person is not. Then you get into the question of, and here's the moral dilemma with aesthetics as well, because comedy is a kind of aesthetics. Can you, and should you, separate the artist from the art? Such that you can look at the art independently, such that, could I give an example? Could I give the joke and not even mention Louis C.K.? Do you know what I mean? Or is that irresponsible?
Because you're not giving credibility.
Right, I'm not referencing the source of it. Because by analogy, here's an argument or here's an argument against misogyny or something. And then I tell you who said it. The conclusion should follow, regardless of who said it. It should follow if the premises are any good. The analogy is not perfect with respect to jokes, but it is itself a moral question. Can you separate the artist from the art? And I think we do it all the time. And if we didn't do that, we would be bereft. We would not have, I don't think we'd have enough resources to investigate the world. So it's a tough line to draw. Yeah.
I'd just be careful with, I don't know if I'd call him a sex offender.
Oh, yeah.
Knowing what you mean behind it and that there is no malicious intent.
Yeah.
It could seem dismissive.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Because
So I didn't have anything. My personal take when I first saw it in the slides, I thought maybe put it as one of the another readings that aren't crucial for whatever class you're going to be teaching and aren't crucial for the readings, but have a separate analogy in class that are on the slides. So if you want to go look, you can mention it, be like, hey, I did include a separate clip, not on the slides, that do reference someone who is not of particularly fond taste, but has in my opinion, a good view on this topic. Here's a different analogy that I can use in class because it's appropriate for whatever studying versus someone who might make and does probably make some people uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
I do just want to say, I don't know if there's other cases, like maybe Woody Allen, but that you know multiple examples of bits, but not the full, weren't quite sure how to classify him as a sex offender. It's also something to look into.
There's, I do just a lot of research on both of those men. How are you? Just because.
Well,
When,
they're dubious characters with respect to those. Yeah, there's no question about that.
When the Me Too movement kind of came out, I know as a female, particularly, I spent like weeks just like looking through article and article and article to see if this was right, who was telling what.
Yeah.
You know, a big thing is we believe victims and we believe people who.
No, and to. Maybe he came out and apologized because he had to, because he was found out or whatever. But so.
I mean, he's a bad dude, and I completely understand your use of his ideas, and I agree that you could separate the art from the artist, but at the same time, if you present to a body of educational students in which you're presenting big ideas that they'll probably or most likely carry on, it should be important to say this artist was a bad dude.
Right.
Even though bad might be relative, and we can all
No,
consensually
I agree. That's and there's a point at which you it's tough
I know that's
when that has to be included then all the time to be consistent, and that's
hard,
may not be possible. And I think with CK it's pretty easy. It's with Kant, especially when you're dealing with ethics, that's not hard to point out.
Especially
but then you get into the dilemmas of what should be included and why. And no, it's a fair point.
The end of the Woody Allen bit, just before we start.
Woody Allen bit?
Don't we have to the whole movie, or we have to watch a movie or something for the end of class?
Crimes and Misdemeanors?
Yeah. So maybe preface that in class, like before it actually starts becoming a thing, and that'd be a way.
Well, the plan was to watch that in class.
Yeah. So well then
Thank you. I appreciate
no,
you
thank
listening.
you. Thanks a lot.
And you made it.
That's why I wanted to actually talk to you about, sorry about obviously.
Yeah, well, it's not your fault.
Yeah, but I did want to say that I'd love to be able to still turn in my revision and it counts it all. And thank you for emailing me back.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, just remind me in the comment section.
Yeah, I'll write a little note on there, and then the quiz on Wednesday is on.
Quiz due Wednesday, it's online. It'll
Okay,
be on
okay.
Yancy and de Beauvoir. So
right.
it's just a short answer.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. There's no reflection Wednesday then, or is there still?
I don't remember.
I'll check that out.
Probably.
It's
Wait.
fine.
Yes, there is.
There is.
The Grand Inquisitor. That's right. There is one.
Okay.
Sorry.
Have a great day.
You too. Thank you. Yes. Sorry.
There's just a lot of interesting conversation. I'm not very representative of the author's idea.
Sure.
Also, I was thinking about extending that vision or and I was wondering if we did that before, but Winston Churchill, his actions resulted still regarded possibly in history books. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Columbus is another example.
Historically. I don't know if that's a way to define it. But also, I think you said about identity politics being the determining factor of our country. I was like, well, it's what's been a lot of policy and stuff's been based on, and I was like, I was interested in that. And I definitely think that should be engaged with. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But Charles Mills, who we did not read.
Hi.
We're due for political theory in 3 weeks. Do you want to help me with
I could. I was just gonna finish up my conversation with my wonderful professor here. Just but a moment.
He dropped it. He's just not in philosophy. I took intro to ethics with Charlotte Figueroa, like last fall. But she was I'm doing political theory with Ethnic Dry right now, so here on my final. But I got a B+ on my midterm, so.
He's tough.
Okay.
But let me just, I've got to get going too. So what Charles Mills says, he doesn't use the word identity politics. He says for 80% of American history, it's been one of explicit exclusion by law, by force, by violence, by economics, and it's based on what identity group you belong to. So it depends on what we mean by identity politics, because it could be used as a cudgel to say you're just playing, this card, so to speak.
I think when we recognize that it's like been sort of a driving force behind their like nation's like policy and all that, it's also important to recognize like it's not, I don't know, it's kind of theoretical, but it's like you can't solve that problem by like with more identity politics.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
It's tough.
Like it's like a.
How do you maintain if you look at groups that have been historically oppressed, and then now try to avoid using language that relies upon, that leads to more division. So how do you maintain, here's what's happened, here is what the causal factors are from what has happened, without continuing division?
Yeah, if you recognize the apartness, but then say like, okay, so that's what our society is like, and I'm okay with like organizing that way. It's like it's not actually solving any of the.
It sounds like you have a paper here. Perhaps it could be an issue related to this. If that's something you want to focus on, there may be a paper there.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it would be an interesting thing to talk about. I don't know.
Yeah. And I think, how do we put it? That if that difference is driven and it further divides people, and we don't need. Hey, good morning. Or afternoon. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Very well.
See you in class tomorrow.
Yep. We don't need any more division now. We're more divided than ever. And so, feeling for different identities. Hey, how are you? That can increase the problem. The question then is how do you deal with the problems of the past that have still causal efficacy or causal effects, things that are still affecting us today based upon somewhat recent history, without creating further divides. You have to keep in mind the divisions that had led to it, right? And I think that's part of the discussion. It's a complex one, and I think I don't have an answer to it, although I do use this concept of humor. And Yancy will talk about cracking our sense of identities, opening us up to ambiguity, recognizing difference, but that's a bit vague, and it's not really a strategy.
Well, I feel like if the person that's most convinced by like somebody who's like your, the person that's most convinced by that is not by the person who is judging them, but by the person who helps them understand. You know what I mean? Like, so if you can create an understanding, not based on judgment, but based on like facts and like this is just the reality of things. And if you don't acknowledge that, then you're in bad faith. I think that's more of a constructive way to present that.
Yeah, but the problem is that facts, I guess it depends on our audience, sometimes, facts can be upsetting to people and they flee from them. Let's get back to the question of, well, are there alternative approaches to presenting a case that is not straightforward? Because sometimes straightforward arguments, straightforward facts, actually get people who are on the other side even more entrenched in their denial of those facts. I've got to get going, but
okay, yeah, sorry.
I'm curious to think about a potential topic for your paper on that. I might stop in there. Have a good one.